which is progress. Sleep gently. Welcome back. Settle in again. Adjust your pillow if you need to. Let your jaw unclench. Let your breathing find that slow, even rhythm. Tonight, we're staying in the royal bedchamber. Thick curtains drawn. Tapestries muting the drafts. A fire whispering in the hearth. And somewhere in a very large bed, a monarch who is not feeling well, which in medieval and early modern Europe was less a private inconvenience and more a national emergency. Because when a king sneezed, the court panicked. When a queen developed a fever, ambassadors wrote anxious letters home. And when a royal physician entered the room carrying a polished basin and an expression of professional certainty, things rarely improved. Let's drift first to the delicate subject of dynastic fragility. Royal families married within tight circles. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. The family tree was less a branching oak and more a decorative wreath. This was done for power, for alliances, for land. Genetics, unfortunately, was not yet a field of study. So when children were born frail, with enlarged jaws, seizures, infertility, or developmental delays, it was not recognized as inherited risk. It was seen as imbalance, or divine displeasure, or occasionally witchcraft, which feels unfair. We've already visited Charles II of Spain briefly. But let's linger gently. Charles was the final Hapsburg king of Spain. His ancestry chart reads like a social event that no one thought to leave. He struggled to chew because of the pronounced Hapsburg jaw. He struggled to speak clearly. He struggled to produce an heir. His body, quite frankly, was exhausted before it began. And what did his physicians prescribe? Bloodletting. Naturally. Purgatives. Naturally. Exorcisms. Because when you have run out of medical explanations, you may as well consider demons. They fed him herbal tonics. They dosed him with substances that likely weakened him further. At one point, he was treated with the remains of saints, relics dissolved into water. Spiritual antibiotics, one might say. Charles died without children. And with him the Spanish Hapsburg line ended, not quietly, but with the gentle wheeze of a dynasty that had married itself into oblivion. Now let's drift northward. To France, to a king whose name sounds pleasant enough. Charles VI of France. Charles VI began his reign with promise. Young, energetic, crowned at 11, which feels ambitious. But as he aged, something shifted. He began to suffer episodes of severe mental disturbance. He forgot who he was. He attacked his own knights during a sudden frenzy in the forest. And most famously, he believed he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He feared shattering. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to prevent himself from breaking. It is easy to smile at this gently, but in truth it was tragic. Mental illness in the medieval court was terrifying. There were no diagnoses, no therapy, only interpretations. Some believed he was cursed, others believed he was poisoned. His doctors prescribed rest, then bleeding, then more bleeding, because if a king believes he is glass, clearly the problem is excess blood. Naturally, they made it worse. His condition persisted, governance faltered, and France descended into factional chaos, all while its king avoided sitting down too firmly. Let's drift softly into Tudor England, to a man who is rarely described as fragile, Henry VIII of England. Henry was strong in youth, athletic, charismatic, but as he aged, his body rebelled. He developed painful leg ulcers that refused to heal. He gained weight. He became irritable, which may have been unrelated to the ulcers, but we can't rule them out. His physicians treated the ulcers with poultice.
Naturally, they made it worse. He died at 38, having been medically helped his entire life. But let's not stay only with Charles. Across Europe, royal children were fragile, painfully so. Infant mortality was high for everyone, but royal nurseries were filled with children who were both overprotected and medically overmanaged. A mild fever could trigger aggressive treatment, bloodletting for a toddler, cauterization for minor infections, plasters made of questionable animal products. And if a child survived, it was considered divine favor, which, statistically speaking, was doing a lot of heavy lifting. Let's drift further into plague years. The Black Death arrives in the 14th century. No one understands germs. No one understands fleas. But everyone understands fear. Doctors wear long robes and beaked masks stuffed with herbs. The beak was meant to filter bad air, because illness, they believed, spread through miasma, foul smells, corrupted air. So they burned herbs, carried flowers, avoided unpleasant odors, which, sadly, did nothing to stop bacteria. Some treatments included lancing buboes, which sometimes relieved pressure and sometimes introduced further infection. Others drank vinegar concoctions or swallowed powdered emeralds, because if you are wealthy enough, your medicine should sparkle. And then there was trepanation, drilling holes into the skull to release evil spirits or pressure. This practice predates medieval times, but it certainly persisted. To be fair, occasionally it worked when relieving pressure from head trauma, but often it simply created a new problem in the shape of a hole. Let's soften the pace. Imagine a quiet monastery infirmary. Monks were often the closest thing to organized healthcare. They copied medical texts. They grew herbs in cloister gardens. Their treatments were sometimes gentler. Honey for wounds, rest, prayer. And in some cases, that rest was the most effective medicine available, because doing nothing was occasionally better than doing something medieval. But ambition has always been a feature of medicine. Alchemy blurred into pharmacology. Concoctions bubbled, powders were ground. Some physicians prescribed ground mummy. Yes, powdered remains imported from Egypt. Because someone somewhere decided that consuming a preserved corpse was invigorating.
It was called mummia. It was popular. It was, unsurprisingly, not helpful. Now let's drift back to humors. Melancholy, they believed, came from excess black bile. So if you were depressed, they might bleed you, or purge you, or prescribe a strict diet avoiding cold foods. Imagine being deeply sad in 1300, and your treatment is soup restrictions and strategic stabbing. One begins to see the limitations. Women fared no better. Childbirth was dangerous, extremely so. Midwives relied on experience and prayer. Physicians, when called, often intervened dramatically. Forceps would not be widely used until later centuries, so obstructed labor frequently meant tragedy. And postpartum infections were common. Treatment? Bloodletting. Of course. Now breathe again, slowly. Notice how many of these cures involve removal. Blood, fluids, limbs, teeth. Extraction felt decisive. It felt like action. And action feels reassuring when you don't understand the problem. Even kings submitted. Even queens endured. Because illness does not respect crowns. And medieval medicine, in its earnestness, was both hopeful and catastrophic. Let's drift over to the next quiet absurdity. Astrology. Doctors often consulted the stars before treatment. You couldn't just bleed someone randomly. The moon had opinions. Certain zodiac signs governed different body parts. Bleeding a leg under the wrong constellation was apparently ill-advised. So treatments were scheduled according to celestial convenience, which must have been comforting. To know that your survival depended not only on your immune system, but also on Mars. And yet, despite all of this, humanity persisted. People survived infections. Wounds healed. Children grew up. Not because of the cures, but in spite of them. And slowly, over centuries, observation began to challenge tradition. Anatomists dissected bodies quietly. Physicians questioned Galen. New ideas stirred. But that is for later. For now, remain in the candlelit chamber. Hear the crackle of fire. Smell the herbs hanging from beams. Feel the cool stone walls. A patient rests beneath wool blankets. A doctor stands nearby, holding a bowl. Concerned. Certain. Completely mistaken. And yet trying.
Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when medicine was confident, creative, and almost entirely unhelpful. So dim the lights, settle into your pillow, let your shoulders soften, take one slow breath in, and let it out gently. Good. Because tonight we are wandering into the medieval sickroom, a place of incense and anxiety, of whispered prayers, of bowls filled with things you absolutely did not ask to drink. A time when doctors wore robes, carried complicated opinions, and solved most problems by removing something from you. Blood, teeth, dignity. Sometimes all three. This is the story of medieval medical cures that, more often than not, simply hurried you along to the afterlife. Not maliciously, of course. They meant well. They just didn't know anything. And that's an important distinction. Let's begin in a drafty stone chamber. The year is somewhere around 1200. You are unwell. Perhaps feverish. Perhaps coughing. Perhaps you simply look a little pale, which in medieval Europe was considered deeply suspicious. A physician arrives. He has studied at a university, which means he has read books written by ancient Greeks who also did not know anything. He nods gravely. He feels your pulse.
He studies a jar of your urine against the light. This was standard. Medieval doctors practiced uroscopy with the dedication of art critics examining fine glassware. And after much contemplation, he announces the problem. Your humors are unbalanced. Of course they are, because in medieval medicine, everything came down to 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Too much of one, too little of another, and suddenly you are melancholy, feverish, or inconveniently alive. The solution? Balance. And the fastest way to balance anything, apparently, was to remove blood. So they did. Frequently, enthusiastically. Bloodletting became the go-to remedy for headaches, fevers, plague symptoms, smallpox, insomnia, and occasionally just general personality flaws. Feeling tired? Bloodletting. Feeling anxious? Bloodletting. Feeling perfectly fine? Preventative bloodletting. Because naturally, removing pints of your circulating fluid during an illness was exactly what your weakened body needed. Sometimes they used lancets, sometimes knives, sometimes leeches, which at least had the courtesy to look embarrassed while doing it. And people fainted, often. If they survived the illness, they survived despite the treatment, not because of it. But we mustn't judge too harshly. They were working with what they had, which was very little. Now let's drift to the barber surgeon. Yes, barber surgeons. The same person who trimmed your beard might also remove your infected limb. Convenient. The red and white barber pole you may still see today, that comes from this era. Red for blood, white for bandages, a spinning advertisement for minor amputation. You arrive with a festering wound, perhaps from battle, perhaps from stepping on something medieval and regrettable. The barber surgeon examines it. He squints, he shrugs. Out comes the saw. There is no anesthesia as we understand it. Perhaps a bit of alcohol, maybe a piece of leather to bite down on. And then, efficiency. Because infection spreads, and they did understand that rotting flesh was bad. They just didn't understand bacteria. So amputations were common, swift, and often fatal. But sometimes, you lived, which, in fairness, was impressive. Let's drift to something gentler, something domestic. Herbal remedies. Now, herbs occasionally worked. Some plants genuinely have medicinal properties. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. But medieval dosing was less measured science and more hopeful handful. If a little is good, more must be better. Spoiler, it was not. Some remedies included foxglove, which contains digitalis, helpful in tiny doses, catastrophic and enthusiastic ones. Others involved mercury. Yes, mercury. Applied to skin conditions, ingested for syphilis, rubbed into sores. Because if the disease didn't kill you, the heavy metal poisoning might. And then there were purges. If illness meant something inside you was wrong, the obvious answer was to get it out. Emetics, laxatives, enemas, repeatedly. Until whatever strength you had left politely excused itself. Now
This is how progress often happens, not through grand declarations, but through small moments of noticing. Now let's drift towards something even quieter. Hand washing. It seems obvious now, almost insultingly so, but for centuries physicians moved from patient to patient without washing hands. Blood on sleeves, instruments reused, because dirt was seen, and visible dirt could be wiped away. But invisible contamination, that was not yet a concept. It would take centuries more for germ theory to fully emerge, but seeds were planted. By the late 17th century, the invention of the microscope allowed scientists to peer into previously unseen worlds. Antony van Leeuwenhoek observed tiny organisms in water. He described them as animalcules, little animals. He did not immediately connect them to disease, but the door was open.
A new scale of existence had been revealed. Tiny, persistent, everywhere. Now let your breathing slow further. Imagine a physician holding a primitive microscope, peering into a drop of water, seeing movement where none was expected, a whole invisible ecosystem. It must have been both thrilling and unsettling. If such creatures exist in water, where else might they be? Still, widespread acceptance would take time. Medicine is cautious. Tradition resists replacement. Meanwhile, hospitals improved slowly. Ventilation was considered. Waste disposal managed slightly better. Isolation of contagious patients began to make sense. Quarantine measures were introduced in port cities. Ships suspected of carrying plague were held offshore. 40 days, 40 giorni, which is where quarantine finds its name. It was not perfect, but it was strategic. Recognition that disease could travel, that distance mattered, and that prevention might be more effective than treatment. A revolutionary thought. Now drift into a late 17th century ward. Patients lie in rows, some feverish, some recovering. A nurse moves quietly between beds. She washes her hands more often than her predecessors, not because of microbes, but because she has noticed that cleanliness seems to help. Observation again. Soft, steady, persistent. Now let's gently revisit royal medicine in this shifting world. Monarchs continued to receive elaborate treatments, but gradually court physicians adopted new anatomical knowledge. Dissections informed diagnosis. Instruments improved. Ligatures reduced bleeding. And while humoral theory lingered stubbornly, cracks had formed. The old certainty was no longer absolute. Doubt entered the room. Quietly. And doubt, though uncomfortable, is fertile, because it invites questions. Now imagine standing at the edge of this transition. 1 foot in medieval certainty, 1 foot in early modern inquiry. Doctors still bled patients, but less aggressively. Still described purges, but more cautiously. Still believed in miasma, but now wondered about unseen agents. Medicine was not transformed overnight. It stretched slowly across centuries, incremental, human, and deeply imperfect. Now let the hospital corridor fade into shadow. The lanterns dim, footsteps
gradually, carefully, because questioning ancient texts required courage. But it happened, and with it, surgery improved incrementally. Ligatures replaced cauterization in some cases, which reduced trauma. Techniques refined. Instruments sharpened with intention. Not perfection, but progress. Now let's soften everything again. The battlefield fades. The surgical table dissolves into shadow. The saw grows still. The monk extinguishes his candle. For all its brutality, medieval surgery was not random cruelty. It was an attempt to intervene, to save, to act, and sometimes it succeeded, more often than we might assume. Because while many died, many also healed. Scars formed, bones knit, limbs were lost, but lives continued. Human resilience carried what medicine could not, and slowly, knowledge accumulated like dust in a library. In the next part, we'll drift toward the turning point, the slow birth of hospitals, the cautious arrival of sanitation, and the revolutionary idea that perhaps invisible things might be causing visible disease. A radical thought. For now, rest with the steady rhythm of history. Knives set down, candles dimming, bodies recovering in silence, and surgeons, exhausted, hoping they did more good than harm. Sleep gently. Let your breathing settle again. The battlefield has faded.
the saws are quiet. Now we drift somewhere calmer. Stone corridors, soft footsteps, the low murmur of prayer. Tonight we wander into the early hospital. Now, when you hear the word hospital, you might imagine clean white walls, machines humming gently, reassuring beeps. Medieval hospitals were not that. They were closer to charitable shelters, places of rest for the sick, the poor, the elderly, religious orders founded infirmaries. Monks and nuns cared for the ill as part of their spiritual duty. The focus was not aggressive treatment. It was comfort, which, considering the alternatives, was often preferable. Rows of beds lined long halls. Patients shared space. Illness spread easily. But there was at least supervision. Someone to bring broth. Someone to change bandages. Someone to whisper prayers in the night. It was imperfect, but it was a beginning. Now drift gently to the city of Florence in the 14th century. Hospitals grew larger, more organized. Records were kept. Patients categorized. Still no germ theory. Still no antibiotics. But a growing sense that illness could be managed collectively. And yet, something invisible continued to undo their efforts. Let's linger in that word. Invisible. For centuries, disease was explained through imbalance, miasma, or divine will. The idea that tiny organisms, too small to see, could cause illness would have sounded absurd. Because if you cannot see it, how can it exist? And yet, slowly, the evidence accumulated. Physicians noticed that wounds cleaned more thoroughly healed better, that certain environments seemed to spread sickness, that proximity mattered. They did not know why, but they observed patterns. Observation is a quiet revolution. Now let's drift forward into the Renaissance. Anatomy theaters appear. Students gather to watch dissections. The human body becomes a subject of direct study rather than ancient speculation. One name rises gently into view: Andreas Vesalius. Vesalius questioned Galen's anatomical descriptions. He dissected human bodies himself. He published detailed illustrations. He demonstrated that certain long-held beliefs were simply incorrect. It was not dramatic rebellion. It was careful correction. And it marked a turning point. Because once you begin questioning one authority, you may question others. Now breathe slowly. Hospitals continued evolving. By the 16th and 17th centuries, they were more structured. Separate wards. More consistent supervision. Still crowded. Still unsanitary by modern standards, but less chaotic.
Survival was unpredictable, but not impossible. Let's drift into a quieter surgical setting. A town chamber. A man with a bladder stone. Bladder stones were excruciating and common. Diet and dehydration contributed. The procedure to remove them was called lithotomy. It involved cutting into the perineum without anesthesia. The surgeon had to locate and extract the stone quickly. It required remarkable precision and extraordinary tolerance from the patient. Some surgeons became famous for their speed. Families passed down the technique like a trade secret, which is touching if your family tradition happens to involve swift pelvic incisions. Now breathe slowly. Surgery in this era was divided socially. Physicians diagnosed, surgeons cut. Physicians were considered intellectual, surgeons were considered manual laborers, despite the fact that surgeons often dealt directly with life and death. Hierarchy matters, even in crisis.
Now let's drift to trepanation again. A head injury, a swelling beneath the skull. The surgeon believes pressure must be released. He drills, carefully. Circular motion, a small piece of skull removed. Sometimes this genuinely saved lives when relieving internal bleeding. Sometimes it introduced infection that finished what the injury began. But the intent was rational. Release pressure, restore balance. And so, through trial and error, a crude form of neurosurgery persisted. Now imagine a royal patient requiring surgery. This was rarer. Monarchs preferred less invasive cures, but when necessary, they submitted. Take Louis XIV. In 1686, Louis XIV underwent surgery for an anal fistula, a delicate matter. Surgeons practiced beforehand on unfortunate volunteers. Instruments were specially designed. The procedure was performed successfully, without modern anesthesia. The king survived, which sparked a brief fashion trend. Courtiers, in solidarity, claimed to have similar ailments, because nothing says loyalty like elective surgery. Now let's soften the scene. In a monastery infirmary, a monk tends to a wound. He cleans it with wine, which by accident contains alcohol. Alcohol kills some bacteria. He applies honey. Honey has antimicrobial properties. Without knowing why, he improves the outcome. Not through theory, but through observation. And here we begin to see something shifting. Medieval medicine was not entirely blind. It was bound by tradition, but practical knowledge accumulated quietly. Surgeons noticed that certain methods reduced infection. They did not know about microbes, but they knew what worked more often. Experience was their teacher. Now let's drift into dentistry. If you had a toothache, the solution was straightforward: extraction. The barber surgeon returned, pliers in hand. He gripped the offending tooth, pulled firmly. Sometimes the tooth broke. Sometimes it came free cleanly. Sometimes it took fragments of jaw with it. But afterward, the pain changed, which felt like improvement. Infections of the mouth were dangerous. Abscesses could spread. Without antibiotics, even a tooth could become fatal, and so removal felt decisive. Removal was medieval Mason's favorite verb. Now let's drift gently into childbirth again. Because surgery intersected painfully with labor. When a baby could not be delivered naturally, options were limited. Cesarean sections were performed rarely, and usually when the mother was already dying. Survival rates were low, instruments were crude, sterility non-existent, and yet midwives carried deep experiential knowledge. They knew positioning. They knew herbs that stimulated contractions. They knew comfort. Sometimes that knowledge saved lives more effectively than scholarly theory. Now breathe again. In. Out. Imagine the quiet after a procedure. The patient pale, bandaged, breathing shallowly. The surgeon washing his hands in a basin, not because of germ theory, but because blood is inconvenient to leave on one's sleeves. The room smells of iron and smoke, and everyone waits. Will fever come? Will infection bloom? Will the wound close cleanly? Medicine at this time was
Now breathe slowly. Imagine a dim royal chamber again. A queen lies pale after childbirth. Her attendants hover. The physician suggests a restorative broth of spices, honey, and perhaps gold leaf. Gold was thought to strengthen the heart. Thin sheets dissolved into drink, which meant that somewhere a monarch was literally consuming treasure in hopes of improved circulation. Did it work? No, but it shimmered. And sometimes shimmer is persuasive. Let's drift briefly toward one of the most quietly tragic royal patterns: over-medication. A slight cough could trigger bleeding,
purging, dietary restriction, herbal tonics, prayer rituals, amulets, astrological timing, and perhaps a cautious exorcism, all layered together. The body, already struggling, endured the illness and the cure. And survival, when it happened, felt miraculous, which reinforced belief in the treatments, because correlation is seductive. If a king survives after drinking emerald powder, then clearly the emerald worked. The fact that many others died quietly is less discussed. Now, let's soften the scene. Outside, rain taps against castle windows. Inside, a physician grinds ingredients carefully in a mortar and pestle. The rhythm is steady, almost soothing. He believes deeply in what he is doing. He has studied ancient texts. He has memorized humoral correspondences. He has seen patients recover, which confirms his methods. It does not occur to him that those patients might have recovered anyway, because human beings prefer intention to randomness, and medieval medicine was full of intention. Now, as the fire dims, let's drift toward one final royal absurdity of the night: the belief that touch itself could heal. In England and France, kings practiced the royal touch. They believed their divine authority allowed them to cure scrofula, a form of tuberculosis affecting the lymph nodes. Ceremonies were held. The king touched the afflicted. Prayers were spoken. Coins were distributed. Did it cure scrofula? Rarely. But it reinforced the idea that monarchy itself was medicinal, which is a remarkable branding strategy. And so medieval and early modern courts glowed softly with misguided cures. Powdered jewels dissolved into wine, mercury rubbed into wounds, mummies turned to dust, kings pressing hands to swollen necks, all beneath flickering candlelight, all wrapped in certainty. And yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, doubt began to grow. Anatomists questioned tradition. Observers noticed patterns. Some physicians dared to suggest washing hands. Radical. But that revolution is still ahead. For now, rest in the quiet absurdity of jeweled tonics and edible treasure. In the next part, we'll drift into surgical practices, battlefield medicine, and the delicate art of surviving an operation before anesthesia was a reliable concept. So breathe in and out. History, like medicine, moves slowly. And tonight we move with it. Sleep gently. Welcome back. Let the lights stay low. Let your breathing settle into something soft and steady. If your mind is still humming from the day, imagine it dimming, like candles being gently pinched out one by one. Tonight we drift into a louder place. Not loud in excitement, but loud in sound, because medieval surgery was not subtle. It was decisive, it was physical, and it was done while you were very much awake. Let's begin on a battlefield. The year could be 1350, or 1450, or 1500. It hardly matters. The injuries are similar. Arrows, sword wounds, crushed limbs, broken ribs, and somewhere nearby stands a surgeon. Not a university-trained physician in flowing robes, but a practical man with rolled sleeves, possibly the same man who shaved faces in peacetime. He carries knives, saws, hooks, needles. His tools are clean by visual standards, which is to say, they look clean. Bacteria has not yet introduced itself. Now imagine you are the injured soldier. You are laid on a wooden table. There is no anesthesia as we know it. There may be alcohol.
Diamonds. Well, diamonds were thought to neutralize poison, which is impressive because diamonds are essentially very stubborn rocks. And yet, physicians recommended grinding these gems into fine powder and mixing them into drinks. Imagine being handed a goblet of wine with a subtle crunch. That's not sediment. That's a fortune being ingested. Did it work? No, but it did demonstrate commitment. And in royal medicine, appearance mattered almost as much as outcome. If a king was ill, the treatment had to look serious, expensive, dramatic. You couldn't simply say, perhaps rest. You had to produce a substance that glittered faintly in candlelight, because that felt medical. Let's drift towards something even more unsettling. Mumia. Powdered mummy. Yes. For centuries, European physicians imported ground-up Egyptian remains and prescribed them as medicine. It was believed that the preservation of the body somehow preserved vitality itself, which is a bold interpretation of embalming. The logic, if we can call it that, suggested that consuming preserved flesh might transfer its durability to the patient. Naturally, it did not. But it was popular. Royal courts purchased it eagerly. Imagine explaining that to the mummy. Centuries of peaceful rest, only to become a tonic for a mildly anxious duke? Now let's drift into royal kitchens, because diet was also medical. Humoral theory dictated that foods were hot, cold, wet, or dry. If you had a fever, you needed cooling foods. If you were melancholic, you avoided cold ingredients, which led to highly structured royal menus. Take a noble suffering from gout, a condition ironically linked to rich diets. Doctors recommended reducing certain meats, but often prescribed sweet syrups, spiced wines, or elaborate broths instead, because austerity was not fashionable in palaces. One cannot recover from illness without peacock pie. And yet, gout thrived. Royal feet swelled, walking became theatrical, and physicians continued recommending moderation, delicately. Let's wander into one of the most ambitious cures of the age, the universal antidote, theriac. Theriac was a medicinal compound dating back to ancient times. It contained dozens of ingredients, sometimes over 70. Opium, herbs, honey, spices, occasionally snake flesh. It was considered a cure-all. Poison? Theriac. Plague? Theriac. Melancholy? Theriac. Existential dread? Probably theriac. Preparation took months. It was ceremonially mixed in public, stored carefully, aged like fine wine, and administered with reverence. Did it cure plague? No, but it did contain opium, which meant patients felt tamer about dying, and that, in its own subdued way, is something. Now let's drift towards mercury again, because medieval and Renaissance physicians were unreasonably fond of it, especially for treating syphilis, and syphilis in royal courts was not uncommon. Let's gently acknowledge that monarchs were not known for restraint. Mercury was applied as ointment, inhaled as vapor, ingested in tills. Patients drooled excessively, their gums deteriorated, their teeth loosened, they trembled. But doctors persisted. There was even a phrase, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," which is poetic and deeply unfortunate. Some improved slightly, many did not, but stopping treatment would have implied uncertainty, and certainty was everything. Let's drift softly to alchemy, because medieval medicine and alchemy were close companions. Alchemists sought the philosopher's stone, a substance that could turn base metals into gold,
and perhaps grant immortality. Naturally, royalty funded this, because why not? If you are already ingesting powdered gemstones, you may as well chase eternal life. Elixirs of youth were mixed, distillations attempted, strange metallic solutions consumed. Some monarchs developed chronic poisoning from these experiments, but hope persisted.
And survived the process, which was asking quite a lot. Childbirth was perilous. Queens endured repeated pregnancies. Miscarriages were common, stillbirths frequent, and postpartum infections tragically normal. Take Anne of Austria. Years passed without a surviving heir. Court whispers grew louder. Her body became a matter of state concern. Physicians prescribed fertility tonics, dietary adjustments, religious rituals, and yes, more bleeding, because perhaps excess blood was interfering with pregnancy, which is an impressive misunderstanding of biology. Eventually, she did produce Louis XIV, but only after years of anxiety and invasive medical oversight. And if a queen failed entirely to bear children, well, let's just say divorce was kinder than rumor. Now let's wander east, to Russia, to a royal family that famously placed its trust in a mystic healer, Grigory Rasputin. Although not medieval strictly speaking, Rasputin emerged in a world still clinging to pre-modern medical ideas. The heir to the Russian throne suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disorder passed through royal bloodlines. The boy bled excessively. Doctors treated him with aspirin, unaware that aspirin thins blood, which is tragically ironic. Rasputin, who advised stopping the treatments, appeared to improve the boy's condition simply by doing less. Sometimes doing nothing is revolutionary. Now let's soften the lighting further. Imagine a royal physician standing at the bedside of a feverish queen. He consults texts written centuries earlier. He references Galen. He considers the alignment of Mars. He announces that black bile is excessive, and he orders bleeding, because action feels responsible, even if it drains what little strength remains. Royal medicine was often more aggressive than common medicine, because status demanded effort. If a peasant died quietly, it was tragic. If a monarch died without exhaustive intervention, it was negligence. So they intervened, repeatedly. Kings were purged into dehydration. Queens were bled into faintness. Princes were dosed with mercury until their gums receded and their nerves trembled. And through it all, the doctors were confident. Certainty is soothing, even when misplaced. Now breathe slowly again. In, out. Let's drift into the quieter sadness of royal childhood. Young heirs were often isolated to protect them from disease. Ironically, isolation sometimes limited exposure that could have built immunity. They were swaddled tightly, fed according to humoral theory, and treated at the slightest cough. Smallpox outbreaks devastated courts. Some survived, scarred but alive, others did not. Variolation, an early attempt at immunization, would later emerge. Risky, primitive, but a step toward understanding. Before that, protection meant prayers and perfumes. And if illness struck, the physician returned, with his bowl, and his certainty, and his leeches. We might smile at this from a modern vantage point, but imagine being a royal parent in 1400. You cannot control war, you cannot control famine, and you certainly cannot control infection. All you can do is summon the doctor, and hope, even if hope comes with a lancet. Now let the scene grow quieter. The monarch sleeps. The physician withdraws. The candles burn low. Outside, the kingdom waits. Because in royal courts, illness was political. Succession depended on fragile bodies. Dynasties balanced on immune systems. And medieval medicine, earnest and misguided, stood watch at the bedside. Trying. Always trying. In the next part, we'll drift into the stranger side of cures. Powdered jewels, royal diets that bordered on theatrical,
and the peculiar belief that animals, minerals, and occasionally ground-up humans could restore vitality. For now, rest in the soft absurdity of history, where kings feared shattering, queens endured strategic bleeding, and doctors with unwavering calm made everything just slightly worse. Sleep gently. Welcome back. Let the room grow quiet again. Settle your head just a little deeper